Thank you for joining us for this discussion on the topic of livestock worrying. My name is Fiona Scott. I'm a solicitor in the rural business team here at Produce, and I act for owners and tenants of rural and agricultural property across Scotland, dealing with all property related matters from purchases and sales to ongoing advice for property owners on title matters, residential and agricultural tenancies, land reform, and everything in between. I'm joined today by my colleague Kate Donachie, a litigator from our insurance and risk team. Kate and I have been working together for the last year, focusing on how we can assist clients in the rural sector get to grips with various health and safety issues, other regulatory concerns, and general risk and liability issues. Kate and the team have assisted clients in the past with advice on and review of health and safety policies, procedures, and incidents, vicarious liability for wildlife crime, occupiers' liability issues, and defending personal injury claims. And as her bio in the invitation for this session notes, she also acts on behalf of corporate clients, insurers, and public authorities, so she's got a real breadth of expertise. So the two of us are very pleased to be joined today by Gill Carnegie, who's a senior agent for NFU Mutual and NFU Scotland Group Secretary for Lawrencekirk, Stonehaven and Bankery. Gill is going to let us know about the insurance options and provide some practical advice about managing the cost of that. And of course, she can give us the benefit of her practical insight into the issue and experience of supporting farmers who suffer livestock worrying. So Gill, thanks for joining us. We are approaching peak lambing time and Scotland's stay-at-home order is about to be lifted. Not sure if this is a perfect storm for livestock owners. Do you think our farmers going to be expecting the worst this weekend?
Sadly, yes. I would think everybody will be delighted to be allowed out and about. And obviously dog ownership has obviously risen massively over the last year during lockdown. So there's lots of people with lots of dogs obviously wanting to get out there and enjoy the beautiful Scottish countryside, which is, you know, as landowners, farmers and so on, they love that people are out, but obviously it's about being out responsibly. So yeah, keep those dogs on leads, please.
Absolutely. Well, so I think what we'll maybe do is just launch right into it. So the main thing that we're going to start with today is talking about the new Dogs Protection of Livestock Bill, which was passed by Scottish Parliament a week ago. So the background to that is the perception, if not maybe the fact, that incidents of livestock worrying are on the increase. Actually, the numbers given to the committees scrutinising the bill don't necessarily bear that out. So it could be that it's, you know, increased reporting by media or social media that's given that idea. But there is also widespread acknowledgement that not all incidents are reported. It's not clear entirely why that is, really, maybe because farmers don't think it will be acted upon or taken seriously, so it's not worthwhile. Gill, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, or we can.
Yeah, I think a lot of it for the farmers to actually sort of say, well, we've spotted some of your land, or the dog was maybe not on a lead, they're going to be running around. Most people have a smartphone today, they'll quickly take a video of it and then obviously launch it on a social media site and be a bit angry about it. But actually picking up the phone and phoning the police usually isn't high on their priorities, because not being funny, by the time the police come out, that person's probably away with their dog. The police are incredibly busy doing other things. But even just the reporting of it to get a police incident number raises the amount of times it will then be officially recorded, because, you know, from an insurance perspective and my NFU Scotland hat on, it definitely isn't one of those things that gets reported near enough, whether it be just general, you know, dogs running around without leads, or worse still, hair coursers. We definitely need our farmers to realise that actually just pick up that phone. I know it's maybe 5 minutes, pick it up, log it, and then those instances then can be pulled on a report. further up the tree for somebody to see how many instances are happening of these things, rather than just posting on social media.
Yeah.
I think that's an important point, isn't it, Fiona, that came out of some of the discussion around the bill, was that people maybe, and Gill, I think this is what you're saying, think, what's the point of reporting it to the police? There's not going to be a prosecution or a conviction here because there isn't enough evidence. But actually, okay, there might not be, but if the incident's recorded, it really helps push resource towards this in the future, or just recognise it as an issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, that's something that I think we'll probably come back to and talk a bit more later on. But yeah, being concerned about it taken seriously is sort of something else that is in the background of the bill. The existing legislation is really quite old now. It dates from 1953. And from those seeking to enforce it, they've had a bit of a hard time making clear to people that it is still relevant, that it is really a priority, and that's a problem. So the existing legislation was really no longer felt to be a deterrent, and it was accepted that the law needed to be modernised. So in terms of what the actual bill does, the main changes. So prominence is now given to use of the word attack in the legislation, so to lend gravity to the offence really. It's not that attacking wasn't part of the offence before, but attacking just formed part of what was more widely described as worrying. So now the offence is to be named offence where dog attacks or worries livestock on agricultural land. And while that seems maybe quite a trivial point, actually when it comes to the public awareness and perception and education angle, which is going to be needed to affect any change, and which we'll talk more about later on, that does make a difference, we think. How could anyone disagree that attacking livestock is unacceptable? So the offence is now if a dog attacks or worries livestock, and the definition of livestock has been changed and updated as well to bring in more modern farming types. So it covers things now like llamas and alpacas, deer, buffalo, and also enclosed game birds. So, and then worrying means chasing livestock in such a way as may reasonably be expected to cause injury or suffering to the livestock, or in the case of females, abortion or loss or diminution in their produce, or being at large, and that's to say not on a lead or otherwise under close control in a field or enclosure in which there are sheep. And so that offence of being at large in the field is only relative to sheep rather than other animals. And we know that sheep are really the main issue. So there's no change to the rest of that there. So next, the increased penalties. So the existing penalty was a fine of maximum £1,000, and that was part of the reason that people didn't think that it was really being taken seriously. Now, the original proposal for the bill was for a fine of up to £5,000 and or up to 6 months imprisonment. The final terms of the bill provide for a fine of up to £40,000, and that mirrors the penalties for animal welfare and wildlife offences, and also up to 12 months imprisonment. And on imprisonment, there's a presumption against short sentences in Scotland at the moment, and short sentences is under 12 months at present. So we're not probably anticipating that people are going to be going to prison for livestock worrying offences. But what it means is that making this a crime that carries the possibility of a prison sentence rather than just a fine means that there's options available to a sheriff, including community payback orders, so that can be, like requiring unpaid work, or awareness and educational courses. I'm not sure if there's any of those available just now at the moment, but it's an option for the future. So again, I mean, that's a huge increase in the fine, and those far heavier penalties aimed at making clear that this is an offence that's to be taken seriously, not just a trivial matter. And in addition to the higher fines, there's also additional penalties being created. So if someone's convicted of a livestock offence, then they can be subject to an order disqualifying them from owning or keeping a dog for any period, up to a lifetime order. and there can be an order requiring a person to prevent any dog that they have charge of from going on land that the person knows or ought to know is agricultural land on which livestock is present or likely to be present. Now, there is sort of some doubt over the enforceability of those, proving whether someone knew or ought to know that livestock might be there could be difficult. And there's also, the enforceability of the disqualification orders is a question of who's actually checking. There's a lot of evidence in the committee that made clear that enforcement resources are stretched already. This is an issue of resourcing for people like local authorities. So it's something to add to the armoury, but I guess we'll have to wait and see how it goes with those. And the last point on the changes are that there's increased rights for the police to gather evidence. So under the existing legislation, the police could only seize the dog from the land where the attack took place. And the only purpose for seizing the dog was to identify its owner. Under the new bill, it will be possible for the dog to be seized from any land, so not just from the land where the offence happened. And the purposes for which the dog can be seized are extended so as to include gathering of evidence. So, it seems to me that these are the critical provisions really in terms of the likelihood of being able to prosecute more cases. And that seemed to be the view of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service in responding to the consultation on the bill. It's worth remembering probably at this point that is just because the penalties are higher doesn't mean that more offences will necessarily be prosecuted. It's always up to the Procurator Fiscal whether they actually prosecute if they consider it in the public interest and so on. But I think those changes about when the dog can be seized and where from might also make the utility of reporting clearer. So, you can see, as we said earlier, farmers have suffered an attack, but the police can't get there in time, then I can see that there seems sort of, what's the point in reporting at the moment? It's just going to take up my time. But if you can identify the dog, take a picture, as you said, Gill, have a video there, then it might be that you could report and the police would have the ability to trace the dog, later on. Again, obviously resources are going to be an issue for that, but I think that could be a real improvement. So, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think that one of the things that came through in the evidence as well, didn't it, Fiona, was that the police have got the Rural Crime Unit, which I think is headed up by Inspector Alan Drawn, and he gave evidence, and I think he was relatively positive about their intentions of pushing forward with this bill and using the powers it gives the police, not just to sort of seek down prosecutions, but also to educate the public. And so I think from the police side of things, there is a bit of resource there, and there's certainly a will to be more visible and to be more active. And so hopefully that's a positive to come out of the process, is that sort of statement of intent.
Yeah. I think that's right. There's definitely did seem to be commitment to doing it. There's the Rural Crime Unit, there's the kind of Scottish Partnership Against Rural Crime, and it is just a case of finances, I think, but there definitely was an acceptance that having some modern legislation with serious penalties will make it a lot easier for them to get the message out there that livestock offences are a big issue and something needs done about it. People need to take it seriously. So one thing that hasn't changed in the bill, or that the bill didn't deal with, is compensation. So, and Kate, you are going to tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, compensation was discussed and it came up. It was a big issue, not surprisingly, for farmers and those that were representing farmers, like the NFUS, Gill, because I think it is important how financially the impact this has on people. But the feeling in general from those contributing was it wasn't appropriate for this piece of legislation to deal with compensation.
I mean, do we know why that was?
There were a few reasons. I think the first is there wasn't it wasn't really clear enough for the committee to make a decision on what would go into the bill in relation to compensation, and should there be limits or tariffs, and how would that be assessed. And so there were just practical issues, I think, and limitations of time, which meant that they just didn't think it was appropriate to go down that route. But another point that was raised was that compensation already exists, so via the criminal and the civil suing someone for damages processes.
Yeah, so that's there is already compensation available, but I think there's questions over whether it's really full access to compensation. I think there was a suggestion that maybe only 10% of farmers affected actually get compensation.
Yeah, I mean, you've already highlighted the lack of data there is around this, which is a big problem. I don't think 10% is a particularly controversial estimate. I think it's probably accepted that most farmers don't get compensation. And is that your view as well, Gill? Would that accord with?
Yeah, I mean, most of them would tend, if they've got worrying on their insurance policies, and say this has happened, X amount of animals have died or had to be put down, or we've lost X amount of lambs, we've been aborted early, and they would look to the insurer probably to make the payout rather than pursuing the individual through the courts, because obviously it's quite a lengthy process, it's time consuming, and it could be expensive as well for them. So I think there's a reticence probably from them to move forward with taking court action.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that the system for compensation isn't really working at the moment. We are hoping that there's going to be scope for it to be looked at again, I think.
Yeah, Emma Harper, the MSP, who it was a private member's bill, this one, and it was Emma Harper, an MSP, who put it forward, and she said during the discussions in committee that she would like to consider compensation schemes separately. And so I think there's an indication that this is something that might be returned to. But it was also suggested by some others that actually the answer is increasing awareness of the current options, and that's the best way to increase the uptake of compensation. Yeah,
okay, so yeah, well, I mean, that makes sense. If you don't know that you can do it, then you're not going to pursue it. I mean, do you think that'll work? Will raising awareness help? Jill sort of mentioned there's likely to be some reasons that you might not want to pursue it.
Yeah, I don't think that's the main problem. I think there are real practical barriers, just as Gill has said, to people making claims on through the existing routes that we have.
We should cover those off. So what are the current options for compensation at the moment?
Sure, well, there are three. So there's the criminal route, there's the civil route, which would be raising an action, and there's, as Gill has mentioned, the farmer themselves can have insurance, so they can claim on their own insurance policy. And so in terms of the criminal route, this would be where a farmer was being prosecuted, a dog owner was being prosecuted. So the police had investigated and the procurator fiscal had decided there was a crime that should be prosecuted. And it's possible to include during that prosecution a claim for a compensation order, which is where the judge, when they're sentencing the offender, would say you should pay a certain amount of money towards the victim of your crime. But that's not particularly straightforward. Obviously, there needs to be a criminal prosecution, so you need the police and then the Crown Office to decide that it will go ahead. It needs to be successful, so you need the sheriff or the judge to decide that there has been a crime, and you need to persuade the prosecution in the first instance to ask for the compensation order. You need to present your evidence to the prosecutor, and then the judge or sheriff has to agree that this is appropriate. And the final problem is that the amount to be paid is decided with a view to how much the dog owner can pay. So if the dog owner doesn't have any money, there'd be no point in going through that whole process anyway.
Okay, yeah, well, so you can see why people maybe don't want to do it. I mean, the advantage of the criminal, or looking to try and get that compensation order, is that you presumably don't need to incur your own legal costs.
No, you don't. But I think, as I touched on there, because you will need to correspond with the procurator fiscal and exercise a bit of persuasion and probably persistence to get them to push forward a compensation order, and you'll need to put together evidence that's sufficiently compelling to support your claim. you might find that you need to have a lawyer involved anyway, and you won't get those costs back. That won't be included as part of the compensation order that's paid.
Okay. So I can see why people don't really pursue this route. So the next option is the civil option, so suing for damages. Then.
Yep. And the sort of obvious first advantage of this over the criminal route is that you would control the procedure. So you're not reliant on people deciding there should be a prosecution to go ahead, or being persuaded that a compensation order should be included. So that's an advantage.
But it needs then you to raise an action against the dog owner, so you're instructing a solicitor. Yeah,
so it's also the downside, I suppose, because you're exposing yourself to legal costs and the risk of being found liable for the dog owner's costs if you're not successful.
Okay, and do you have to prove that the dog owner has been negligent? Is that?
No, that's one positive you don't. In terms of the Animals Act, where a dog causes harm by biting or otherwise savaging, attacking or harrying, and harrying means disturb, distress or exhaust by repeated demands or criticism, the owner is strictly liable, which means you don't have to prove they've done anything wrong. You get straight over that point.
Okay, so that sounds much better, apart from, I suppose, the legal costs. What else is there? What else would you need to do as part of the action?
Yeah, well, so aside of the legal risk of legal costs, you're going to have to identify the dog and then prove that dog caused the damage, and you're going to have to identify the owner, and then you're going to have to put together the loss that you've suffered. And unlike with a criminal prosecution, that investigation would be up to you, and you're not going to have the same power or resource to carry it out. And then, ultimately you come back to the same problem you have with going down the criminal prosecution compensation order route. You're limited to how much the dog owner can pay. So if they don't have any money, you're not going to get any money out of them. It just isn't very satisfactory. And so you're left with the third option, which is the one that Gill mentioned there, which is taking out insurance and paying for that yourself. So I suppose it's really for you, Gill, to explain to us what those options are and what the drawbacks of that might be.
Yeah, I mean, obviously every insurance company is slightly different, and the rates that they will charge for something are slightly different. It tends to work on your herd value. So how much are your sheep worth in total? That's obviously from the oldest and ugliest to the youngest and cutest. And you would look at that, and then they base the worrying rate on the sum insured. Things like postcode rating, all sorts of fun stuff, all get involved in what rate you ultimately are charged, because you could be in an area where worrying is not a huge issue and your rate will be lower than those where worrying is really prevalent, and insurers are paying out regularly. There's obviously always an excess with insurers, I'm sorry, but it tends to be roughly around the 250 mark. It could be even higher. So again, you're not likely just to be trying to claim for one or two sheep. It's going to have to be a significant amount of sheep that have been worried, injured, or lambs aborted to make it worth your while claiming against your insurer. The other point then is, if you do start claiming, then obviously your insurer is going to look at your premium and say, well, you've made X amount of £1,000 worth of claims in the last couple of years, so we're going to put your premium up. So of course, it's great to have the cover. It's nice to be able to claim against it, but if you do keep making regular claims, then it's going to cost you more in the long run. So a lot of farmers feel penalised that, one, they have to pay the insurance for it, and two, if they do claim against it, it means that the insurance premium may go up anyway. So I think if there was a more simplistic way for them to get some form of compensation for their losses, then that would be a huge benefit to them. Because again, it's not just the monetary value that's, quite often the issue. There's also the emotional element to a farmer as well. I know these things are bred to be eaten ultimately, but actually there's a great lot of love and care and attention put into the livestock while they have that wonderful life, and it devastates farmers and their families to see their livestock being injured. Because again, they're just innocent animals and they don't understand why they've been chased. Because obviously they're herd animals, and I know they're cute little doggies, but to a sheep, it's a wolf, and it's a terrifying thing. So, it's not just the monetary monetary, it's the emotional that they have to deal with.
Yeah, thanks. Is that, in fact, Kate, is that something, I mean, is that something like a, compensation for distress that can form part of a damages claim?
It could, yeah.
Okay.
And so, but you generally wouldn't be thinking, you wouldn't get much money for that. I think possibly the distress that Gill's talking about is maybe more of an incentive to find a solution for farmers. And so, I don't know what shape any future discussion on compensation will take, but I think when we've discussed this amongst ourselves previously, you're talking about low-level claims, Gill. You're saying it could be, I think the average claim's around £700, so with an excess of 250 and a premium and potentially increased premiums for claiming and all the hassle that's involved in making claims, it's not really proportionate, and it's certainly not proportionate to take a civil action for £700 with all the risk and that entails. And Gill, I think maybe a good question for you is, how often would NFUM pay out a claim and then look to recover the cost of that from the dog owner, by raising an action against them, which you would do in a road traffic case?
Yeah. When it comes to paying out for sheep worrying, it is unfortunately on the rise for insurers, NFU Mutual being the biggest rural insurer. So we are seeing more and more of a problem. It did, there was a small decrease apparently last year in dog worrying, but the losses that I think we paid out were sort of well into the millions. I have not known us ever to go after an individual, because again, it is, like you said earlier, about identifying the individual, identifying the dog, and actually proving the case in court. And again, for £700 to £1,000 that we may have to pay out to a farmer to then try and pursue an action would be more costly. So it's not really something that is done, if we're going to be honest. Sorry.
And I think that kind of, leads you to the conclusion that it's a different structure that's maybe needed. And so some kind of fund that would just pay out on a no-fault basis, whether that fund is paid into by farmers, as a sort of cooperative, or whether it's a tariff on dog ownership, if you were going to be really radical about it. So I think that the discussion around compensation needs to be had, and hopefully it does happen in the quite near future. But I think the approach maybe does need to move away from the traditional avenues of compensation that we have, because they're not really working for farmers, I don't think.
Yeah. It just seems clear that as as much as you can say, that there's compensation rates available, that it's just not worth saying that if they're not actually in practice possible. And there is, we're coming on to talk about this before. There was kind of discussion during the bill about wider dog control measures, and it could be that something comes about from those. There's lots of different dog control statutes around, largely kind of decided or said to be not fit for purpose. The Control of Dogs Act 2010, but there's dog control notices and things can be put down under, can be served against a dog owner, in terms of those, if there's been, if the dog appears to be out of control. And so you can see that maybe there is an argument for something wider, as you say, maybe a compulsory insurance, something that farmers could then make use of.
Yeah, I think that this needs to be something maybe a bit more holistic, and if it is, whether getting into dog control, it just becomes too big to manage under this, but there definitely was a view when this bill was going through Parliament from the MSPs on the committee and from the people giving evidence that the dog control laws, like you say, Fiona, aren't fit for purpose. There are too many acts. Some of them are really old. There's no real sort of overall design to it, and maybe that leaving sheep worrying to one side, just as a society we need better rules and a better system, and for dog welfare as well. It's not just about the harm that dogs do, it's the harm that's done to dogs. So that's a bigger topic, I think, than this, but it's possibly something that we'll cross over.
I know. So, well, I mean, I suppose that's all kind of for the future. And so if we think about it, it does seem that insurance, it seems to be the only realistic way that farmers can get any recovery. But then there is this off-putting thing of, well, but if I make a claim, then my premium's going to go up. So is there, Jill, are there things that can be done to reduce your premium after a claim?
Yeah, I mean, there's always things that can be done. And I mean, hindsight's a wonderful thing. We have some signage.
Oh, I think we've lost Jill.
Yep. I think Gill was moving on to talk about what practical steps can be done to reduce the likelihood of it happening, which would in turn reduce the premiums that you pay for your insurance. But I think there might be a concern there. If it's restricting people's access to your land, are you going to fall foul of the Land Reform Act?
Yeah, so I mean the right of responsible access under the Land Reform Act includes rights for people to enter and pass through fields, including fields with livestock in, and they should ensure that any dogs are under proper control in order to do that, because being on or crossing land while responsible for a dog which is not under proper control is excluded from your statutory right of responsible access. So strictly speaking, somebody or not in control of a dog, it would be trespassing. But otherwise, generally, there is a right to be on land, and landowners and occupiers are bound to respect those access rights, and you can't try to prevent or deter access takers by, for example, locking gates or putting up no entry signs, just for the sake of it. But some actions can be acceptable, provided that the main purpose of those actions is not just to deter access in and of itself. So the main case under that legislation is concerns a landowner that was concerned about horse riding on a path through their land, and that they were finding that the horse riding was damaging it. And so they closed the path to horse riders. An alternative path was made available. And so there, even though access was restricted on that original path, then that was acceptable, an acceptable restriction of access rights, because the main purpose was a genuine land management decision to protect the path itself, which remained open to walkers and dog walkers and things. It was just horse riding that wasn't allowed. So translating that to the livestock in a field situation, it would probably be considered legitimate to put up signs directing walkers away from a field with pregnant animals or new lambs or calves, and in particular telling walkers with dogs not to use a particular route. And Jill, thanks. So we've got you back now. Hopefully you can hear us again. Not at all, don't worry about it. So we were just picking up, saying that I think probably signs and things were what you were going to talk about, practical impacts for reducing your premium.
Yeah.
So I was just going on to talk about that, and then some of the evidence to the committee from
and also thinking about the field, like I was saying.
Go on.
Sorry, no, it was about the fields as well. If you know that a field is a particularly well-used dog walking field, and that you've had issues in the past, think about whether you would put your in-lamb ewes or lambs in that field, or would you use it for cattle who are less likely to be bothered by the sheep, by the dogs, sorry. So it's about thinking about your land and how you're using it. And I know it's not ideal for farmers to have to think about switching fields, but again, it's about being practical and forward planning. But yes, signage is great. Speaking to people, we're always advocating, talk to the people round about you, explain to them, because it's not that people are deliberately being ignorant, it's just a lack of education. And once you explain to them, a lot of people go, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. And then we'll put their dogs on the lead. You will get the odd person who just is rude, but they're few and far between. So yeah, it's education is a key one for me.
Yeah, bit of a recurring theme, I think. So yeah, as you say, so directing people away from paths that you know are used, or you know, as you say, taking the stock elsewhere. You know, you might not have the option to take stock elsewhere. Some of the but directing people to other routes. You know, some of the evidence to the committee from Nature Scot SNH discussed things like management measures, good information, good fencing, gate arrangements, and provision of paths and stuff. And so that all sounds like it's the same things that you might try and do to reduce your premium to try and stop it happening in the first place.
I think that the wording of provision of paths just makes me a bit uncomfortable from a liability risk perspective. I don't think it would be reasonable or sensible for farmers to feel they had to provide pathways or formal routes through farms.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with that. And I mean, well, from the cost perspective, there was mention of kind of tying up with community path groups, which might cover off funding issues to start with. But even then, you know, it's not something that's going to be feasible, or why should you have to provide an actual path? You know, it's not, especially if we think about, you know, tenant farmers, they're not going to have the right to make changes to the land like that in terms of their lease, maybe. Might be reasons the landowner doesn't want a formal path. So yeah, I don't think a formal path itself is what we're after.
Yeah, and from a liability point of view, you have no obligation to make a right of way safe. But if you do provide a formal path or other form of landscaping, you do then incur a duty to avoid anything you've done causing an injury. So even if you put up fences, for example, to steer people, and that fence falls over and someone gets hurt on it, you could be liable if they're having an injury. So it's just treading a fine line between guiding people and, you know, as you've talked about, Fiona, not restricting access unreasonably to the land, but not doing anything too much that you then might just make a rod for your own back in terms of ongoing maintenance and inspection.
Yeah. So
from an
go on.
Sorry, from an insurance perspective, again, it would be something we would want to know. If you're doing something specific on your farm where you're offering a service, so it's a different route, then again, from the liability element, we would very much want to know about that and factor it into, unfortunately, your premiums. And it would be something we would be making sure you are upkeeping and doing what you can on it. So again, I agree with both of you that it's a nice thing to offer, but just be aware of it.
Yeah, realistically, there's issues with it. So then I think what we're probably left with, the sort of reasonable and effective route, is probably signage in terms of the best thing to do, that you're not taking on, you know, the farmer is not taking on too much liability, but they're doing what they can to protect their stock and keep dogs away.
Yeah, and NFU Scotland are doing some great work at the moment. They've tied themselves up with the Kennel Club, and it was a really interesting meeting the other week. And you know, he had various other suggestions on what can be done. But there's about to be a big marketing campaign by NFU Scotland on obviously recognising routes and leaving gates as you find them. There's a whole load of things they're going to be doing over a month-long campaign. So hopefully people will see that starting to pop up on things like Facebook, Twitter, and so on. It's sharing it. Hopefully somebody is and somebody isn't. It'll pass its way around the World Wide Web eventually. So yeah, it's all about, you know, the education, signage, and so on. And hopefully there'll be some great posters that we can put out into the rural area as well from this campaign.
I think one of the things with signs is, you know, you put a sign up, you leave it for 5 years and nobody's looked at it for several, because it becomes part of the landscape. And so you've got to be quite clever with your signs, haven't you? You know, it's not just a case of putting up any old sign and leaving it. You've got to use them strategically. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. There's the outdoor access code, has signs as well, and they have the ones that I was looking at when I was preparing for this have, they've got pictures and they've got dates, so it's for putting up with the dates on there, and with the farmer's details, and suggesting, saying please don't come in this field. There's new calves, new lambs, and so on. And I think, yeah, it's that way that new signs appearing at that time should make it clear to walkers, especially the local walkers, that are, you become sign blind to things, or you just stop noticing things. So hopefully, but putting stuff up and taking things down means that they should be taken into account.
And I think there was some suggestion, wasn't there, from people at the committee that putting dates on them. So actually saying, April 2021, we are lambing in this field. People can't ignore that. It would be very difficult to say you thought that was last year's. So it is maybe just being as absolutely plain as you can that this is happening now.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the other thing that maybe comes up is, I think you would say, Gill, sheep being in lamb, or pregnant sheep, aren't as easy to spot as sheep that have lambs running around their legs. And so, with the best will in the world, some dog walkers might think it's okay to walk through that field. It doesn't look like there's anything particularly vulnerable there. So a sign really is important to let people know, actually, this is what's going on, and this is why we're asking you to go another way, not just being difficult.
No, I mean, obviously at this time of year, they're in lamb, they're more rotund, but they've got still their lovely big woolly coat on. So you do struggle to see the shape beneath the coat. And I would defy most folk to not look in a field where lovely little lambs are running around and their hearts melt. But when it's just maybe not the most beautiful sheep, and you're just like, oh, it's just a sheep. So yes, it's about tugging on those heartstrings, folks, and going, there's a cute wee lamb in that not so beautiful sheep, don't hurt her or else it won't be born. So again, farmers love to talk about what they do. You'll stand for hours at a farm gate if you let them. So again, if the farmer chance, I'm looking for people walking around their local vicinity, and most farmers are delighted to talk to people and tell them what's going on and when we're expecting the lambs, and come back with your kiddies and have a look. And so it's not that we're, as farmers, trying to get people away from us. Actually, we love that you love the countryside and you do, but just appreciate it in a respectful manner, and allow nature to take its course.
Yeah, and I suppose that kind of comes back to this land reform obligation you have, or right people have to be in your land. Is if you work with people and you make them understand, the reasonable ones, like you said, Gill, will always be a hardcore of people who don't care, but people that do, if they think this isn't coming from a place where the farmer just doesn't want you there and he's making he or she are making excuses to keep you away, but actually there's a real need and they can feel more part of what's going on in the farm. So I suppose it is on the farmer, but probably the engagement and the signage and the education is to be inclusive rather than and being negative, I suppose, to try and win round cooperation rather than force it on people.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of engagement with people and communications and stuff is a bit of a recurring theme. I'm just looking, we've had a couple of questions in, and I think they might be quite useful to, it's things that we were maybe thinking about talking about, and it's a question for you, Gill, the first one, asking, in respect of the claims that you see, is there a pattern? Does it come from people visiting the countryside who just lack education and don't keep their dog on a lead, or is it unaccompanied dogs, stray dogs around fringes? You maybe don't know, because you maybe, the point is people have to claim their insurance because they don't know how it's happened.
Yeah, there's elements of both, unfortunately. Sometimes we do have people coming out to the countryside and are just unaware of what is locally, because they're not from this area. And again, sheep or livestock might be over the brow of a hill, so the field looks empty, and of course they've just let their dog off because there's nothing in the field. And of course dogs shift a lot quicker than we do, and they can be up and away before you realised that there's maybe something in the field. But we have had lots of incidences where local people, unfortunately, are just letting their dogs run. Latchkey dogs rather than latchkey children. They sometimes don't know where their dog is. The dog's gone out into the garden, it's lit the dike and it's gone. Could be away for a couple of hours and it decides it's coming back. Obviously, everybody's working from home. You've maybe just got your head down and you're busy and you've not realised that the dog's away. We have had instances as well where people have driven out from the local town to the countryside, opened their door, let their dog out, they've taken it for a walk and they've sat in the car while that dog is stewed about. And again, that is not responsible dog ownership. And again, when challenged by one of my farmers and members, he was rather impolitely told to stop. And obviously that didn't go down terribly well. And it did end up, unfortunately, after several instances of this person not walking their dog, that the dog did eventually end up shot by the farmer because it was worrying his livestock. And again, she then reported our farmer to the police for shooting her dog, whereas he'd felt he'd given her plenty of opportunities to get out of the car and walk with it and put it on a lead. So it was just an unpleasant time for all parties. But ultimately, the farmer was unfortunately right in what he did, and he didn't want to do it, but he felt he had no other option. He couldn't catch the dog. It was worrying his livestock, and he felt the only other option was to shoot it. So parties, unfortunately.
I think that that kind of brings us on to the second question, doesn't it, Fiona, which is in an extreme. And I think it's important to be clear here. A farmer never has a right to shoot a dog, but what he or she has is a defence to the offence of so it's an offence to shoot an animal like that. But you have a defence if you can show you had, as a last resort, you had no other option but to do it to save your livestock from being worried. So it's a really bad situation, as you say, Gill, for everyone to be in. Also, from the farmer's point of view, can put their gun licence under scrutiny, which would be really problematic from a business point of view as well. And I know this happened in Fife recently, a couple of weeks ago, and I think that sort of started a social media furore, and there were very strong feelings on both sides, but I think it's just unhelpful, where I think the key, as we kind of landed on, is cooperation and a sort of education and asking people to be reasonable and sensible and not kind of hard line with people, that this is just a really sad outcome, and we would all hope that we can, things can be done better so we don't get to that desperate point where the farmer feels they've got no other option.
No. Farmers don't want to be shooting people's dogs. Most farmers would have a dog themselves, and although they're working dogs, they're also a pet, and all they are usually burly lassies and lads, but they've also got great big soft hearts, and it does upset them if it comes to something like that. It's not the thing that they want to do, because again, I would understand that if their dog was shot, they and their families would feel the loss, because again, most people's pets are a member of the family, and this is why this is such an emotive subject. Because obviously people will look and say sheep are your business asset, where a dog is part of the family. But again, most farmers will look at their cattle and their sheep, their deer, whatever it is, and they are part of their family. They put a great deal of love, care and attention into these things. So yeah, it's so emotive from all sides, unfortunately.
And that's, when you say that, when you talk about, the kind of treasured family pet, and going back to what you were talking about, latchkey dogs just seems absolutely, and Kate and I have talked about this, which is why she's laughing, because it seems kind of alien to those of us who probably maybe live in more urban environments where dogs are, you know, the kind of pampered pooch, and people think, gosh, well, I'm not even prepared to tie up my dog outside a shop because dogs are stolen. But then the suggestion and the evidence to the committee was that up to 70% of attacks took place without the owner present. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are these latchkey dogs. It could be, you know, dogs that have just got away whilst they're on a walk. But I am really interested to know what the experience is of the audience. So we've got a very quick poll. Now, also, we don't know where the audience are, so this could be completely unrepresentative, but we've got a quick poll, which will hopefully come up on your screens shortly, poll number 1. And it's just, are you aware of dogs being let out to wander or exercise themselves in your area? So if people can vote now, no, so as I say, actually, I have realised now that I've no idea where the participants are from. So maybe if you can comment for anybody that said yes, because we do have some yeses. So I think what I'll do, I think probably everyone just about has voted. So we'll end the poll. And so hopefully you can see the poll results now. So it's 2/3 no, but a third yes. So that is interesting, I think. And Kate and I were also talking about, there's a public education advert that's been relaunched in Ireland, and we'll maybe come on kind of just to finish up talking about sort of public education and awareness raising, and it's an advert by RTE, the Irish broadcaster, and the kind of cartoon dogs being let out to roam, and they turn into a kind of snarling pack of wolves. And yeah, it seems odd, but you know, then obviously it does happen. And as you say, you know, that's your experience as well, Gill, that it does. Well, people just drive and then just let their dog out to exercise themselves, even if they're driving and sitting there.
And that gets you back to the education being the only way into this, because the dog isn't going to read a sign and say, all right, I'll find another way because this is the wrong time of year for me to be here. So I think that kind of brings us back round to the, you know, how do we get a public information education message out to the country now? We don't, I think, you know, as we discussed, we're not all sitting watching Coronation Street at the same time every night anymore, and watching the same adverts. So how do we capture the attention and I suppose the imagination of the nation with this kind of message that, you know, is kind of gone out of date?
Yeah. I think that's maybe why NFU Scotland have teamed up with the Kennel Club, because again, if people are buying puppies, then obviously it's the type of thing that when they get their absolutely new cute bundle of joy, we can hopefully start the education process right then and there. This is a new puppy to you. How are you going to train it? How are you going to teach it? You know, because ultimately they are pack animals and you are part of their pack. So as their pack leader, you are ultimately there to train that dog how to behave in all sorts of situations, whether it be at home, walking down the street, again, walking out in the countryside, through a wood, wherever it is, that dog has to be able to behave, but also be a dog as well, you know, have a bit of fun, but know that when you call it back, or if you want to keep it on lead, it's not going to get away from you and start chasing livestock, other dogs, or small children, or whatever it is. So again, it is about educating somebody when they've got their puppy. How do you train this puppy? How do you turn it into a good dog and a good member of society? So yeah, I'm pleased that NFUS have signed up with the Kennel Club, and hopefully we'll get that message out there.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely, as you say, for people that are getting puppies or got puppies, and over recently, sorry, and I mean that's one target. And actually, we did have another poll about this, just to see what the audience think and what. So here we go as well. If you can choose up to 2 of these, so what do you think would be the most effective way of raising public awareness campaign? Because as you say, we've got things like targeting dog owners associations or shelters or things maybe, but then that's only dealing with people when they're acquiring the dog, and obviously there's millions and millions of dogs out there already, so we need to get it out to the wider people as well. So we've got quite thank you everybody that is answering, and lots of people are looking at this now. I don't know what if anybody is prepared. Kate or Gill, are you prepared to tell us what you think your top two would be? I'll give a couple of seconds.
I would do educating the children, and then also sort of kennel clubs and pets association pounds and so on. I mean, my children are now in their teens, but when they were at nursery, Michael Recycle, they're amazing recyclers, my children, because it was drummed into them at the nursery. There was so many things drummed into the children. You must do this, mummy, you must do this. And it was like, gosh, boom. And, they're teenagers now, and it's still the same. They would never look at a plastic bottle or carton and think that they would just toss it away in the general waste. They would know to separate from the main because of different plastics. So are so able to be influenced in such a positive manner that if you told them about what your beautiful little doggy might do to that beautiful little lamb, they would not want mummy or daddy letting that dog off the lead. You've got to protect the environment, you've got to protect things. And again, I defy any parent not to look at their little cherub and be like, okay then.
Yes, pester power.
Yeah, pester power. Exactly, that's what I was about to say. Yeah. So hopefully, I think you can all will be able to see the results. So yeah, the audience agrees. Education targeted at children, get in early, and then also social media advertising, which I think is the same. And that's still what you were saying that NFUS are doing with their kind of wider campaign, looking at it, putting it out on Facebook, things like that, and hopefully it gets shared. Now I'm conscious that we're probably quite short of time, so I think we're going to have to wrap up and conclude things now. So just a reminder, so what we're talking about, the bill at the start, that's due to come into force 6 months after royal assent, so we're anticipating that will come into force this autumn and winter. We're clear that what's on its own, it's not going to be enough, it's not going to solve the problem. We need this awareness raising exercise, and hopefully that'll all be put in place in the lead up to it coming into force and thereafter. And there does seem to be appetite from the police and Police Scotland and the SPARC more generally. It's going to be a question of really whether there's funding available to get into that. And I think we also need to remember, and we talked about it, that farmers have a role to play in reporting kind of each and every incident. It's even where you think it might not end up in a prosecution, it's vital for the issue to get the resources it needs for the full picture to be known, really, not just on social media after it's happened again, but logged and recorded with the police. And because that's how you'll be able to get funding kind of channeled towards it. So I think that's all we've got time for today. Thank you again, Gill, for joining us. That's been really great to have your insight. Thank you to our audience for listening and participating. We hope you found it useful. And yeah, that's all we've got time for. We've got our contact details up there for anybody that would like to get in touch for any questions that we've not been able to cover. Thanks.
Thank you.